Dear Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, today we are gathered at a special commemorative meeting of the UN General Assembly in memory of all the victims of the Second World War. On May 9th, the final act of unconditional surrender was signed in the Berlin suburb of Karlhorst. Nazism was defeated in its lair, Berlin, which was taken by the Red Army. On May 1st, the red banner of victory was raised over the Reichstag, and on that day, the chief of the General Staff of the German ground forces arrived to tell Soviet General Trikov about Hitler's suicide in his bunker. The most terrible page in history was turned. The world was saved from plunging into the abyss of racial superiority theory, where the value of human life was determined by measuring the skull with a tripod. It is important to remember that this terrible theory was not a figment of Hitler's imagination. It was born among European intellectuals. One only has to recall such a work as Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races by the French writer Arthur de Gobineau. Only the Nazis supplemented the colonial racism traditional for Europeans with radical anti-Semitism and anti-slavism. One can only imagine a world in which such European values would win. And at some point, this is what happened. The followers of Nazism and fascism gained popularity or came to power in many European countries. Therefore, Hitler's march was practically triumphant until it encountered the heroic resistance of the peoples of the Soviet Union. It should not be forgotten that Hitler enjoyed the sympathy and support of a number of members of the British royal family. Italy, Finland, and Romania fought on Hitler's side, providing him with 700,000 soldiers, a legion of French volunteers, Spanish volunteers, the Norwegian SS Legion, the Dutch SS Legion, the Latvian SS Legion, which distinguished itself by its particular cruelty, the Estonian SS Volunteer Legion, the Belgian Volunteer Division, the SS Volunteer Corps Denmark, which became part of the German SS Division Death's Head. Ukrainian nationalists also fought on Hitler's side. In 1941, all anti-fascist forces managed to unite. Ideological opponents, the USSR, the USA and Great Britain, who had episodes of armed confrontation behind them, showed wisdom and stood shoulder to shoulder. At that time, no one could even think of playing ideological games, trying to equate fascism and communism. It was clear to everyone where good was and where evil was. Any other decision would have been fatal for the entire world. We thank all participants of the anti-Hitler coalition and honour the contribution of the Allies to the victory. In Asia, China led the fight against Japanese militarism. Evil was defeated, but the victory came at the cost of millions of victims. China lost 35 million people in the war, the USA about 500,000. Serbia organised the largest partisan movement in Europe. The struggle for the freedom of nations was waged by heroes from Latin America, Asia and Africa. The price of the Soviet Union was 27 million lives, with irreparable military losses alone amounting to 12 million people. The multi-million civilian casualties were the result of the genocidal policy carried out by the Nazis against the peoples of the Soviet Union. The war with the USSR had different goals than in Europe. Thus, on June 12, 1941, Himmler declared that the goal of the campaign against Russia is to reduce the number of Slavs by 30 million people. Another laconic and simple statement belongs to Hermann Göring, the successor of the Führer, the head of the economic staff Ost. In a conversation with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Fascist Italy in November 1941, during a routine discussion of starvation for 30 million Soviet citizens, he declared, "Some peoples must be reduced." Those in power in the Axis countries perceived the necessity of genocide of the peoples of the USSR with their characteristic pragmatic cynicism. The goal was to extract food from the Black Earth regions, including Ukraine, and redirect it from the so-called forest zone, Moscow and St. Petersburg, to Europe. In addition, it was planned to populate the Soviet territories with Germans, which required getting rid of the native population. The plan for genocide was documented in the Directives for Economic Policy in the Field of Agriculture, a product of the Ost Economic Headquarters based on the research of the Nazi economist Herbert Bacher. At the Nuremberg trials, these directives were presented by the American side. The American prosecutor Whitney Harris described them as follows. The pages of this document reveal a premeditated plan to kill millions of innocent Soviet citizens by starvation. The document clearly states that the murder of millions of innocents was premeditated. The document shows that this plan of murder was to be carried out on a scale so vast that it surpassed all human imagination. Thus, the terrible tragedy of the Leningrad blockade, which took about 1 million lives, was not an accident or the result of the siege of the city. It was part of a general, deliberate policy of starvation. But hunger was not the only weapon of genocide. As Hitler said, "We are talking about a fight for annihilation. This war will be very different from the war in the West. In the East, cruelty itself is a blessing for the future." Guided by this message, the Nazis showed unheard-of cruelty towards the civilian population of the USSR. Carpet bombing led to the destruction of 1,740 cities, and more than 70,000 villages and hamlets. Over 6 million buildings were burned or destroyed, and about 25 million people were left homeless. The extermination of the population of entire settlements was practiced. Here, one cannot help but recall the Belarusian village of Khartin, where 149 residents were burned alive, including 75 children. This crime involved 200 Ukrainian nationalists from the OUN-UPA organization led by Stepan Bandera. They also became famous for their participation in particularly brutal acts of the Holocaust, including the pogroms in Bendry in July 1941, in the shootings of Jews, for example, in Babi Yar near Kyiv and in Sosenki near the Ukrainian city of Rivne, where 23,000 people were killed. One cannot help but recall the terrible Volyn massacre committed by members of the UPA. As a result of this crime, 50 to 60,000 peaceful Polish people died. The fate of Soviet prisoners of war was no less terrible. They were starved, often placed in the open air, and subjected to medical experiments. In the death camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Soviet prisoners of war became the first victims of the gas chambers. We must not forget about the millions of Ostarbeiters, citizens of the Soviet Union who were forcibly transported to Germany. Their slave labour was used by such well-known companies as Daimler-Benz, Deutsche Bank, Siemens, Volkswagen, BMW, Bayer and Hugo Boss. Ordinary Germans did not disdain the use of slave labour either. They submitted applications for these people and came to the distribution centres, or in fact slave markets, that were set up in Germany in the 20th century. However, all this did not break the Soviet people. They went not only to the front, but also to partisan detachments. Prisoners of war demonstrated unparalleled courage, raising uprisings in death camps. Mr. Chairman? The terrible pages of Nazi atrocities did not require proof. They were known as an axiom. However, the time came when the sacred memory of the heroes and victims of Nazism became the subject of an attack by historical revisionism and revanchism. The unnatural Nazi idea of dehumanizing representatives of inferior nations began to be whitewashed, and its followers were elevated to the rank of heroes, not only in the circles of marginal radicals, but also at the level of state policy. Thus, marches of former accomplices of Hitler began in the Baltic countries. In these and other Eastern European countries, monuments to heroes who gave their lives for the victory over Nazism began to be torn down. From the territory of neighbouring fraternal Ukraine, After the unconstitutional coup on Maidan and several years of brainwashing, slogans of Ukraine above all began to sound, which is a tracing of the Nazi slogan Deutschland über alles. Unfortunately, the parallels with the Third Reich do not end there. All this is happening against the backdrop of the demolition of monuments to fighters against fascism, the proclamation of the deputy commander of the Abwehr Special Forces Unit, Nachtigall Roman Shukhevich, or the Nazi accomplice Stepan Bandera as national heroes, torchlight processions on memorable dates for neo-Nazis, and a ban on the Russian language. Thus, in Kyiv, the avenue of the Soviet General Vatutin, a hero of World War II, the liberator of Ukraine from the Nazis, was renamed Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukhevich Avenue. Mr. Chairman, we will not let the international community forget that Hitler's followers did not remain in 1945. Nazism is reviving and rapidly gaining supporters. The number of right-wing radical movements and their participants is steadily growing in Europe. They use modern methods and means of attracting supporters, especially from among young people, social networks and messengers. They even manage to hold rock concerts, organize sports events, or give lectures. All this is not a one-off, but a systemic nature. We closely monitor the situation and publish relevant reports. They are trying to convince us that honouring Hitler, his followers and ideology is the exercise of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. But last year and this year in Berlin on May 8 and 9, near Soviet war memorials, they banned the display of not only the Victory Banner and St. George ribbons, war songs, but even orders and medals and uniforms of victorious soldiers, including in photographs of war participants. Moreover, high-ranking EU officials are threatening sanctions for participating in the Victory Parade in Moscow and are calling on people to go to Kyiv at that time. The question arises, who will be honoured in Kyiv? The millions of Ukrainians who heroically fought in the Red Army and gave their lives in the fight against fascism, or the Nazi collaborators Bandera and Shukhevich? Clarity is needed on this issue, since it is impossible to unite the victims and their executioners. It is noteworthy that those states that have been obstructing the General Assembly's adoption of the Russian-initiated resolution combating the glorification of Nazism for several years now refuse to celebrate Victory Day. Is it conceivable to vote against such an initiative at the UN, an international organization that owes its name to the self-designation of the states that were members of the anti-Hitler coalition? Mr. Chairman, we must remember that the victory brought not only freedom and relief from suffering, but also a new world order with the central role of the UN, built on the principles of cooperation, sovereign equality, and non-discrimination. I wouldn't be surprised if today they try to tell us an alternative history of World War II, in which the exploits of Soviet soldiers will be replaced by tales of occupiers and communist atrocities. But no matter what fakes we hear, only one fact matters, which the world will always remember. On May 9th at 0:43, Hitler's Germany finally capitulated. We won a victory over Nazism, which you will not take away from us. Russia's commitment to preserving historical truth will remain unwavering. Despite what our enemies are trying to claim, we do not monopolize the victory. We consider it common and pay tribute to the memory of all the peoples of the former USSR who made a significant contribution to the victory in the Great Patriotic War. All the peoples of the Soviet Union contributed to the victory. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Moldovans, Balts, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmens, Jews, and dozens of other nationalities of our vast country. This year, together with our comrades Belarus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz Republic, China, Serbia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, we initiated the adoption of the General Assembly Resolution, the 80th date of the end of World War II, according to which the anniversaries of victory will be celebrated in this hall every 5 years. I will conclude my speech with the words of Marshal of the Soviet Union Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, also known as the Marshal of Victory. It was he who accepted the capitulation of the German armed forces in 1945. Every year, we move further and further away from the war. A new generation of people has grown up. For them, the war is our memories of it. And there are fewer and fewer of us, participants in these historical events. But I am convinced, time has no power over the greatness of everything we experienced during the war. It was an unusually difficult, but also a very glorious time. A person who once experienced great trials and triumphed will draw strength from this victory for the rest of his life. This is also true for the entire nation. Our victory in the war against fascism, to put it in a lofty language, is the finest hour in the life of the Soviet people. In those years, we became even more hardened and accumulated enormous moral capital. Looking back, we will always remember those who did not spare themselves to defeat the enemy of our motherland. Thank you for your attention.